Now, some are saying that that seems to be a bit of a change of tune because in 2017, Harry claimed it was his brother William who encouraged him to get help. Now, he used the series once again to take aim at media in the UK, claiming that the press didn't cover British soldiers being wounded in Afghanistan. The documentary has its critics, but fans were delighted when the Prince surprised some at a screening of the show in California overnight. Now, I think that those who are criticising what he said in this are really mischief-making because I've watched, and I took one for the team, I've watched the whole series today. I've watched all 5 episodes. Yes, you can thank me in kind later. I'll take drinks, I'll take cash, whatever it might be. And it is actually a really good show. But the point of the show is not about Harry. The point of the show is about the veterans, the wounded veterans, many of whom with life-changing injuries, who went on to compete at the Invictus Games. Clearly, that's the point, and some of their stories are amazing. Real tear-jerking moments. Now, of course, it's Harry's games, and Harry is going to have to sell this series to get Netflix, the bums on seats, all the TV ratings that they need. So he had to give a bit in order to get that. And I think that when you see that comment in the context, he's talking about how important therapy is. And he's saying, he's not saying my family were rubbish. He's saying nobody around me was a qualified therapist. And that's what I needed at the time.
And that's kind of the whole point around the Invictus network. It's not just about the games, but it's about allowing the veterans to have access to people who've been through similar things that they have, and also to speak to veterans from all walks of the Army, the Navy, about how important mental wellness is. And I think if you've watched, and I've watched them all like you have, and I think after watching them, if all you can extrapolate is lines about the royal family, you've completely missed the point.
But they are the most newsworthy lines, that's the point.
Absolutely, but there's some really incredible stories. The guy with one arm, Gabriel, who is in constant pain, and the doctors tell him his pain is at the level of someone being in labour, and he's in that pain constantly for his whole life whilst doing archery and swimming. Have the story of Tyra, who was a Ukrainian vet who was on the Invictus team. They didn't make it to the games in Hague because she was captured by Russian soldiers.
And tortured.
And tortured, actually, and that to me is far more interesting and newsworthy than making up all these headlines that don't exist.
Listen, they're great stories. I agree, they're great stories, and I'm sure they are tearjerkers. But for the general public, they're not interested in hearing those stories without having Harry at the front to bring those stories out. That's not going to be the front of a newspaper. A soldier goes to war and gets injured. Like that's not unfortunately newsworthy. But I do agree. Some members of the press have obviously, but they're journalists, so I can't really blame them for it. They've found a line and they've run with it. But it is extremely misleading, obviously, when you see it in full context.
I'm actually looking forward to this documentary. I can see from Kev's face that he's not so enthusiastic. I haven't watched it all, but I think it's going to be really good. I think the Invictus Games is something that Harry can be incredibly proud of. I hear what everyone's saying, that, of course, we, the media, will home in on the Harry line. But actually, it sounds as if it's been really well done. One thing I would pick up on is when he says that the media weren't covering the stories of the soldiers at the time, those personnel who were wounded. Well, that is because serving personnel can't just speak out. They would have been prevented from speaking out by the Ministry of Defence at that time. So that's a little bit misleading.
And that's a good point, actually, that people need to realise. And I think, when we kind of look at all these lines, I think, you do have to have that kind of context that you've given when we're talking about the series.
But I think, first of all, it's not true that the press didn't report the injuries, and this is a subjective feeling that he had returning from Afghanistan, so forgive him for that, but that isn't true. And every week, as an illumination of what was going on in Afghanistan, the press and the television did that awful thing where the coffins came back and were wheeled through the streets of Wootton Bassett. So it was very much in the mind. So that's not sort of true, but I think he got it kind of wrong, to be fair. But I would never in any way mock him for his courage out there in Afghanistan and for the trauma, the mental health trauma he clearly suffered when he got back. So, yes, but I think in the end, you're probably right, Daisy. and you're right, of course, JJ, as you always are, that this was. He knows how to sell a documentary. That little moment when he tells this story, he knows that's going to make all the front pages.
Yeah.
So fair play. But I do still, with all due respect to his bravery and the suffering he's been through over the death of his mother and fighting out there, I do find it kind of sort of slightly uncomfortable when he starts saying, I had no one to turn to. I was all on my own. It was so terrible, terrible.
But a lot of
Look, if you're in the royal family and you break a fingernail, 63 surgeons queue up round the street. He had everyone to turn to. He had his loving family to turn to. He could have got a million therapists, and in the end he did, on the advice of his brother. So there is this sort of slightly uncomfortable thing where he still wants to be the victim, and he's no victim.
But the wider picture, which we all know, is that there now is such an antipathy, a hatred between Harry and particularly the tabloid press, but pretty much all the press. The other comment he made in the documentary was, yet again, repeating the fact that he had his time in Afghanistan cut short because members of the media had disclosed that he was there. I mean, it actually was the Drudge Report, it wasn't the UK media, but if you watch the documentary, you would be forgiven for thinking it was British tabloids that did it.
Right.
The way it was,
we behaved impeccably on that one.
Yeah,
I remember we all knew about it
Exactly.
in newsrooms at the time. I was political editor at the time at the Sunday Times. We all knew about it and we all followed the rules. There was a D notice on it, which meant we were not allowed to report it, and we didn't.
But of course, because
the guy could have put the guy at risk.
Well, of course,
absolutely.
but because he is taking newspapers to court and newspapers are determined to defend themselves, there is this hatred now between the press and Harry.
Well, I don't think the press hate Harry, but he hates the press.